friends, reptiles, country folk, basically anyone who's found this channel. Welcome. Prepare yourselves. Abandon hope. It's spooky season. Last year I did a new costume and a new video every day, and if you'd like to dive through that playlist, there are worse ways to spend an hour and a half. Probably better and more mentally stable ways too, but you know, whatever, you do you. This year we're doing things a bit different because I'm tired. I'm hoping to bring you a whole mix of projects either inspired by Halloween costumes of years past or directly from vintage sources. And what better way to kick things off than to talk about the weird and wonderful world of vintage fancy dress patterns. Let's look at what has been popular over the last 70 years and what that says about the changing face of Halloween. I do think it's important to start out with a discussion of what you are not going to see on this channel and why. If you go looking for vintage or historic fancy dress costumes, you will find some very problematic stuff. And as much as I possibly can, I'm going to be cutting those out. I had to find a balance between making fun videos for everyone to enjoy and making sure that you guys are prepared if you decide to go off and look into this on your own. So I'm not going to be showing you any of the problematic content on this channel, but I am going to talk about it now. Many of these costumes, like Arabian Nights, Pocahontas, geisha, or gypsy costumes, are pretty obviously stereotypical representations of real people's identities and totally not acceptable. To be clear, they weren't okay in the past either, unless you mean it was more socially acceptable to be openly racist in the past, a statement nobody should be nostalgic about. The further you go back, the more blatantly racist these are. But I've also noticed there's a strong USA bias in available vintage sewing patterns online, and I was really surprised at how many Native American costumes I could still find searching on eBay, for example. Most of them weren't even that old. It's not great that these even existed in the first place, but you'd think that in the year of our Lord 2021, people would have got the level of self-reflection to go, you know what, I'm not gonna sell that. I'm just gonna throw it out. Nobody should be making or wearing this. These costumes are not okay. That's not up for debate, and I am not going to be including any of them anywhere in this month's videos. But they are still around, and so obviously we do still need to keep reiterating the fact that they're not okay, they never were, and you shouldn't wear them. Then there's costumes that were actually genuinely fine at the time, but things have changed. For example, if you look at early 20th century costume designs, you'll often find figures like Lady Luck wearing prominently displayed swastikas, an ancient symbol of great importance in Hinduism and Buddhism that was seen as a good luck charm in the West until the 1930s when it was adopted by the Nazi Party. Obviously now you can't wear that. It's very important to be sensitive not only to how the costume would be perceived at the time, but how it's going to be perceived now, and for that reason I've aimed to skip over anything of that kind. If you're looking to recreate a costume from history, it's worth doing a bit of research to make sure there isn't an alternative, more recent meaning you're unaware of. Sometimes this can go the other way. I will never forget seeing an advert for a gay rainbow costume from the 20s or 30s, and I wish I could find it again so I could make it. Finally, there's the grey stuff. Things that may have been okay at the time and aren't necessarily offensive, but also maybe weren't okay and are offensive, but you're second guessing whether or not you're overreacting to this. It's a surprisingly big category, spanning everything from early 20th century costumes based around cigarette packets, to straitjacket costumes, to the comparatively recent and still widely available Ringling Brothers clown costume pattern, which on the one hand it's just a clown, but on the other hand the Ringling Brothers circus has a blood-soaked history of animal abuse and exploiting disabled people, and I can't exactly say it's supporting them to pick this up secondhand. It's not any different from any other clown costume you could get, but something about it just doesn't, you know? If you spend any time around costume parties, I'm sure you've come across a costume that wasn't exactly problematic, but was still not in great taste. That's personally something I prefer to avoid, and if it's something you enjoy, I would urge you to be conscious of the people around you and how they might feel about it, and about you. I'm not going to be including anything that makes me uncomfortable, but at the same time, I can't rule out the possibility that someone else might be made uncomfortable by things that I think are fine. And that's okay. We should have those conversations. A special mention goes to a subcategory of costumes you will be seeing on the channel, but we should also acknowledge have a checkered history, and that is the big media tie-in costumes. Whether it's superheroes or Disney or Star Wars or... okay, no, these are all the same thing, aren't they? A lot of media that's been around long enough to have their own official costume patterns are also kinda dodge. I'm not personally ready to boycott the big mouse, and I do acknowledge they've put a lot of effort and money into cleaning up their act, but I'm also not going to pretend that they are or have always been wholesome and unproblematic. There's going to be exactly Practically zero Harry Potter costumes though. They can get in the bin. So if fancy dress costumes have so many opportunities to be really quite offensive, why bother with Halloween at all? Halloween is my favourite holiday, and I would argue the best holiday. Getting dressed up, having parties, horror, subversion of societal norms, not being obliged to spend time with anyone you don't want to, like extremely homophobic extended family. When you frame it like that, it's no wonder that many queer people have adopted Halloween as their festival. It's the one night of the year it's entirely socially acceptable to be gross, sexy, frightening, gender non-conforming, or just incredibly weird in public. To let the mask you wear the rest of the year slip, and to be unashamedly the side of yourself that you don't normally let people see. And we know this isn't what Halloween was historically, but the meaning of things change, and it's ours now. Well, ours and the pagans. There's overlap, we can share. Plus, if you hate giving free candy to children, you're a bad person. I'm sorry, I don't make the rules. I think it's super important that we don't just look at all the bad stuff about Halloween, and we also acknowledge how meaningful and subversive something as simple as putting on a costume and expressing yourself can be. Alright, so we've talked a lot about costumes we're not going to be looking at. What costumes are we going to be looking at? Costuming for fun and mischief has been around for a very long time, but I'm just going to focus on the last 70 years or so and the commercial patterns that you will still find available now. For many of these, you'll be able to go out and find something you can use yourself quite easily. The first category is a broad one, and it's archetypal costumes, which is a fancy way of saying the basic costumes children come up with when they think about Halloween. Witches, princesses, devils, astronauts, angels, monsters, fairies. Some of the earliest patterns I found were in this style and often combined multiple different costumes into one pattern based around a simple robe or onesie. If you just want to make some costumes for some kids very quickly and easily and cheaply and reuse it over multiple years, this is what you go for. These kinds of patterns dominated early on. They seem to have been very popular and still are. For children's patterns in particular, the versatility of having a lot of different designs in one pattern seems to have made a lot of sense to a lot of people. The second category is animals, with a special mention for the subcategory dinosaurs. These often also have a range of costumes available from the same pattern, usually a onesie or romper with a variety of tails and ears. But while animal costumes can be very simple, especially with earlier patterns, as you get into the 80s and 90s, you see a massive rise in complexity, along with a meteoric rise in popularity for dinosaurs specifically. The dinosaur costume patterns I found are really detailed. The third category, as much as I hate to say it, is clowns. Clowns are perennially popular for some reason, and the earliest clown pattern I found is from 1936. Unlike the archetypal costumes, however, clowns often appear on their own, as well as bundled in with a bunch of different designs, and there's a much bigger range of shapes. These also seem to change over time. Very early clowns wear a large, loose tunic and trousers, and that design hangs around for a long time, but seems to fade out in about the 80s. A romper shape comes in around the 50s and 60s, and persists to this day, but also in the last 20-25 years we see even more complex clown costumes that resemble actual clothes, just with extra details and colours. Next we have historical costumes. You might assume that historical costumes have always been popular, but that actually doesn't seem to be backed up by what patterns are available. In the 50s and 60s, it seems that the only significant historical costumes available were centennial or bicentennial patterns, USA focused, obviously, usually for dresses, but occasionally with boys' costumes available too. This leads to my personal favourite costume patterns in the 70s and 80s, which are historical dress patterns that aim to cover all the important historical eras for North America with one base dress. They take one simple, fashionable dress pattern, and by changing the sleeves, neckline, accessories, and trim, try and make it work for the Pilgrims, the American Revolution, the American Civil War, and the Wild West, all while being very obviously contemporary to, say, 1986. I love it. Other than a few odd designs, it's only really in the 90s that you see the sudden explosion of, at first, historical and often theatrical or Ren Fair focused designs, and then much later even somewhat accurate costumes appearing. There's a weird subcategory that comes alongside this one. Vintage historical costume patterns are so very USA centric that if you go looking for them, you also run into a collection of costumes I can only describe as Americana. This ranges from cowboys and prairie girls to Uncle Sam and Lady Liberty costumes. The patriotic costumes in particular seem to have been around a long time, and it's noteworthy that while in general there are far more sewing patterns aimed towards girls and women than men and boys, the most consistently available men's costume seems to be vampires, the devil, and Uncle Sam. Category numbers 5 and 6 are honourable mentions. At number 5 we have costumes that are not costumes. This covers ballet and dance outfits, majorette and cheerleader uniforms, and ice skating costumes, among others. You could wear these for fancy dress, and indeed I think a lot of people did, but they've been designed with an actual purpose in mind. Number 6 is costumes that are not for Halloween. Although I respect the number of generic costume patterns that you could buy that rolled Santa, the Nativity, and the Easter Bunny in along with Uncle Sam, a clown, and the devil. There was definitely a point at which mass-producing costume patterns became worth doing, but pattern companies also weren't confident they could get you to buy more than one. In 7th place, I can't believe that's your costume. I couldn't come up with a better way of framing some of the more abstract costumes that became available in the 80s and 90s. Do you want to be a raisin? Or a playing card? Or a flower pot? Do you want to dress your triplets up as a banana split? Weirdly specific, but okay, we've got you covered. For the next section, I want to make it clear that for pretty much every era, I have been able to find both adult and child costumes in most categories. Dressing up has been consistently fun for everyone. However, particularly in the 80s and 90s, we see the rise in popularity of a new kind of costume specifically for adults, the sexy costume. These are usually standard archetypal costumes as we would know them. Pirates, devils, vampires, angels, just more revealing, with a few new and definitely adult-focused ideas like waitresses, French maids, and cavemen. It's worth noting that there are definitely costumes for men here, but the sewing patterns in general are largely aimed at a female audience, and most of these are sexy short dresses. I'm slightly baffled by these costumes, particularly from the 90s, because they seem to be both very tacky and quite technically challenging. We're almost done. We're about to roll into my favourite category, licensed media tie-ins. These actually start as early as the 50s, but in my opinion peaked both in terms of number and variety in the 90s and early 2000s. Unsurprisingly, the two big categories in the 50s through 80s are DC superheroes and Disney, with other film franchises coming in close behind. DC totally dominates in terms of superhero costumes. If you put your mind to it, you can get an official Batman costume from every era that there's a Batman. And Disney is a constant presence, although surprisingly you don't see that many princesses. The early focus seems to have been on characters like Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck, or Peter Pan. Not that I'm complaining, since princesses are less my thing, but just not what I would have guessed. Then you have other film characters, Star Wars, Gremlins, E.T., The Wizard of Oz, showing up through the 80s, and then you start to see television characters like Snoopy, the Pink Panther, the Muppets. And before you know it, everyone has a tie-in pattern. Rainbow Bright, Power Rangers, the Teletubbies, Xena Warrior Princess, Sky Dancers, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the Dual Riders series, a cartoon so weird and so obscure that for most of 2 decades I assumed I'd made it up. There's even an official Sailor Moon pattern that is incredibly rare, and I want it so badly. Many of these patterns are now collector's items. It's just that you have to be a very specific kind of collector, and not all of these things are that popular, so the prices vary wildly. Sky Dancers I got for less than a £5. The official Star Wars or Star Trek patterns are going to set you back £30 or more. The Sailor Moon pattern was $200. However, if you make costumes now, you'll know that there are very few licensed patterns these days. The ones that are available are, well, Disney and DC. They still seem to have this market cornered, even though what they offer has shifted, almost exclusively princesses from Disney and almost exclusively female heroes and villains from DC, all clearly with the adult cosplayer in mind. The thing is, pattern companies figured out that they could make things that looked almost exactly like a film or television costume, but just slightly different, and not pay the licensing costs. Which gives us our final category. I can't believe it's not a licensed media tie-in. These costumes seem to have started either because something was very popular but nobody could get the license. I don't think there's a He-Man license, for example, but there are definitely costumes. Or because one of the big pattern companies got a very popular license and another didn't. I mean, I can't see any resemblance between this Xena Warrior Princess design and this woman's Roman warrior costume. Successive waves of popular and lavishly costumed movie franchises like The Lord of the Rings and Star Wars prequels, another set of patterns that are incredibly rare and I would kill for. And later television shows like Once Upon a Time and Game of Thrones, plus an overall shift not only to making more costume patterns but to gradually focusing on an audience of adult cosplayers and costumers rather than family Halloween parties, means that if you look for costume patterns now, for every 7 designs in one simple robe for children, or every historical era is basically the same and uses contemporary dart placement, you're going to find dozens of detailed, intricate historical designs, elaborate steampunk and fantasy outfits that could be costumes or could be alternative fashion, and conspicuously not screen-accurate replicas of things you're already a fan of. The nature of costuming has changed, largely for the better, but that doesn't mean that the vintage patterns, comparatively simple and naive as they are, don't still have a lot of charm. So I guess I should put my money where my mouth is and actually make some. Thank you all for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, then don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. Do all the things that make the YouTube gods happy. As always, there is a link to my Ko-fi in the description box. You'll be seeing the names of some of my Ko-fi donors appearing on the screen now, and if you donate before the end of October, I'll include your name as well. Stay tuned to watch me tackle some vintage pattern instructions in an effort to make some completely ridiculous costumes I will regret. Dream big, and I'll see you next time.